In the spirit and tradition of Thomas Paine's 1776 bestseller, Common Sense, Rudy G. speaks eloquently and with the authority of the founders about current events and how the current administration is fighting the evil globalist cabal for the survival of the Republic. This video is reposted as a public service. Please send this to all your friends and family on social media. Subscribe to Rudy's channel for future episodes. We may post them here. The links are in the description.
Welcome to the first episode of Rudy Giuliani's Common Sense. It's our purpose to bring to bear the principle of common sense and rational discussion to the issues of our day. America was created at a time of great turmoil, tremendous disagreements, anger, hatred. There was a book written in 1776 that guided much of the discipline of thinking that brought to us the discovery of our freedoms, of our God-given freedoms. It was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, written in 1776, one of the first American bestsellers, in which Thomas Paine explained, by rational principles, the reason why these small colonies felt the necessity to separate from the Kingdom of Great Britain and the King of England. He explained their inherent desire for liberty, for freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the ability to select the people who govern them. And he explained it in ways that were understandable to all the people, not just the elite. Because the desire for freedom is universal. The desire for freedom adheres in the human mind, and it is part of the human soul. Today we face another time of turmoil, of anger, very serious partisan division. This is exactly the time we should consult our history. Look at what we've done in the past and see if we can't use it to help us now. We understand that our founders created the greatest country in the history of the world, the greatest democracy, the freest country, a country that has taken more people out of poverty than any country ever. All of us are so fortunate to be Americans. We're not a perfect country. They weren't perfect men and women, and neither are we. But they did it better than anyone else, and we have to hope we can do the same thing, to keep America a leader. But a great deal of the reason for America's constant ability to self-improve is because we are able to reason. We're able to talk, we're able to discuss, we're able to analyze, we're able to apply our God-given common sense. So let's begin. And appropriately, let's begin with the major issue that seems to be consuming us today and for some time. The Democrats would call it impeachment, and the Republicans would call it a coup. And it's, of course, the impeachment that was voted by the Democrats in the House of Representatives, the two articles of impeachment against our lawfully elected president, Donald J. Trump. This is only the third time in the history of this country that there has been articles of impeachment presented to the United States Senate. I emphasize that to tell you how rare it is, because in the motion and the coverage and all the discussion of it, sometimes it seems like, I'm not going to say it's routine, but this isn't so uncommon. I mean, a lot of young people in our society today don't really consult history as they once did. And it's important to understand that we have done this very, very, very few times in our history. Once in the mid-19th century to Andrew Johnson. He was impeached and he was acquitted by the Senate. And a second time more recently to William Jefferson Clinton. He was impeached by the House and also acquitted. And there was one that got very close, but the president resigned, Richard Nixon, before it came to an actual presentation of articles of impeachment. So today we face this very divisive, very startling, very difficult process of government in which, think about it, a group, a partisan group, has initiated a proceeding to remove the President of the United States less than 1 year before the people get to make that decision in November of this year. Again, I emphasize, this is being done, and every day that goes by, as they work their way through it, we're getting closer and closer to the time when you get to make the decision about your president and don't have at least one of those decisions taken away from you by a partisan group. So what are these articles? And what are they about? Well, the power of impeachment was debated very heavily by our framers, our founding fathers. And it was decided that that power be given to the Congress and that it be given great leeway and great scope in being able to carry it out. There are very few words about impeachment in the Constitution. It's a very, very weighty subject about which very little is written. The way it's divided is the House of Representatives sits as a grand jury, if we were thinking of a criminal case, and they decide, are there charges that should be brought that would warrant the removal of the President of the United States? And then that's given to the United States Senate. That becomes the trial jury, presided over by, quite appropriately, the Chief Justice of the United States. That's about all that's said about it, except it has to be voted, the removal by a 2/3 vote. And it almost appears in the discussions that we're having, and particularly led by some of the more rabid Democrats, that the power of the House to impeach is unlimited. There are no restrictions, there are no rules, there are no constraints. Well, of course, that cannot be true because all power in the Constitution is limited. The genius of our framers was to limit all the powers given to government, to define them, to put them within categories so that one branch of government, one person, couldn't become a dictator, couldn't rule everything. So there are words of limitation that limit the ability to bring charges of impeachment or to remove a president. And the words are contained right in Article 2, Section 4 of the United States Constitution. The president can be impeached for only 4 reasons: treason, bribery, high crimes, misdemeanors. He cannot be impeached for anything else. He can't be impeached for something that just kind of appeals to a majority of the House as something wrong or something bad or something offensive. The power is limited. So let's look at these 2 charges. Neither one of them is a crime. The list of crimes, which I'm very familiar with, having practiced law for way too many years and been a prosecutor for a lot of it, most of the federal crimes are contained in 18 United States Code, then in assorted other statute books. There is no crime there called abuse of power. It's a nebulous term. It's a debatable thing. It's more of a theory than it is a charge that's defined. So this is a unimpeachable act. It's not one of the acts about which Congress has the power to vote an article of impeachment. And the way in which they voted the article of impeachment is quite unusual also. They voted it with just a partisan majority. What that means is it was all Democrats, no Republicans. Prior impeachments that have reached this stage have had partisan support. What the Democrats have done is to make Alexander Hamilton's nightmare a reality. Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers and in some of the discussions, although he favored impeachment and he favored giving the power to Congress, feared that it could be abused. He hoped that it wouldn't. But he said someday a partisan group can get together and for purely political reasons, or maybe even corrupt reasons, garner a majority of votes, all partisan, all based on political anger, political jealousy, greed for office, and attempt to or remove a president. And that would be a terrible desecration of the responsibilities that are given to those who take oaths of office to represent us. So I fear that the great Alexander Hamilton, who's buried 6 miles south of here at Trinity Church, is not having a restful period right now, because he thought about this nightmare, but I believe he hoped it would never occur. Well, it has occurred. We have a partisan, totally partisan impeachment. And to make it even worse, we have a totally partisan impeachment that is based on something that is not an impeachable offense, of which there are only 4. What is the abuse of power about? The abuse of power is about a conversation, the core of it, conversation between President Trump of the United States, of course, and President Zelensky of Ukraine. And there are 2 interpretations of it. One interpretation is based on a transcript written contemporaneously with the conversation and attested to by the person who did it as the accurate version of the conversation. And the other is based on a leak before that was actually disclosed, which said that President Trump threatened President Zelensky with not being able to receive his much-needed military funding of somewhere around $400 million if he did not investigate Joe Biden or Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. That was the version leaked to the newspapers. That was the version that was blasted all over the world for several days until it was amended and it was said that the leak was incorrect, that there was no quid pro quo, there was no threat, there was no linkage in the conversation. And lo and behold, the president took the extraordinary act of releasing the entire conversation. And you can read the transcript backwards and forwards or sideways if you want. And what emerges is a cordial conversation between 2 heads of state. Some of it is devoted to funding and the president's complaint, which is rather universal, that a number of countries don't pay their fair share. President Zelensky's agreement to that. And then it turns to the subject of corruption. Why? Because there are serious allegations that in 2016, there was a pattern of corruption in Ukraine that affected the 2016 election, that it involved false evidence being produced, money being paid, Ukrainian officials being used by American officials of the Obama administration and of law enforcement to gather dirt on Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort. Strangely, all the things that the Democrats falsely accused President Trump of appear to have been allegedly done, and I can tell you from my own investigation, actually done in Ukraine. It included activities by the then Vice President Joe Biden to help with that collusion, and in a very dramatic move, getting the prosecutor investigating this thrown out of office, and then sabotaging the main investigation of collusion as well as the investigation of the vice president's son and the investigation of his son's very crooked, multi-billionaire Ukrainian organized crime figure, Mykola Zlochevsky. These are startling allegations. President discusses with President Zelensky the need for us, meaning both the U.S. and Ukraine, to get to the bottom of this. And he goes on for some time talking about the collusion part, just to show what his major objective was. And then, in only 4 or 5 lines out of, some 400 or 500 lines, he says that he has to look into he should look into the allegations about Hunter Biden. Very, very important, the words that he used. The word that he used was, would you do me a favor? He asks him to do it. There is nothing in that text, nothing in that conversation in which he tells him to do it, demands that he do it, threatens him, or in any other way urges him to do it. He asks him to do it. It's a request. So when that appeared, one would think that the whole issue would go away. He wasn't threatened. There was no mention of military aid. There was no force. This was not like the conversation that Joe Biden had several years earlier with the president of the Ukraine, in which he threatened him with the loss of a loan guarantee that was critical to the country if he didn't fire the prosecutor who was investigating Joe Biden's son and Joe Biden's son's crooked boss. The president of Ukraine was told he had 6 hours to do it or he wouldn't receive the money. That's not disputed. That's on tape. So, in fact, Joe Biden did what President Trump was originally falsely accused of and didn't do. The irony in that, the almost sickness in how that can be turned around is of great concern. But the reality is, conversation between the President Zelensky, no quid pro quo, no threat, no words of anger, a cordial discussion. The reaction of President Zelensky, which is the only important one, to the issue of was there undue pressure of any kind, has been numerous statements now made by him that he doesn't see what this is all about, that it was a perfectly normal conversation in which he felt an issue of mutual concern was brought to his attention, and one on which he believes the two countries have to do a good job of working constructively, really to reverse a good deal of the corruption, which is not Ukraine alone. The Obama administration, you're going to find in these episodes, had a great deal to do with making the corruption in Ukraine much worse than how they found it. And Joe Biden was not the only one to be involved in that. He may have profited the most, but he wasn't the only one to be involved in that. But that's for another time. The fact is that the abuse of power allegation does not allege an impeachable offense. They failed to do that. So we have a second article of impeachment. It's called obstruction of Congress. Once again, you can search the statute books far and wide. You can do the old-fashioned search in the library, or we can go and Google it. And you are not going to find a crime called obstruction of Congress. You're going to find a lot of obstruction crimes, a lot of them. Complicated ones, but none involving obstruction of Congress. So once again, the charge is a charge beyond the limited powers that were given to the United States House of Representatives. They charged something that is not an impeachable offense. What is the obstruction of Congress about? This is even more absurd. Obstruction of Congress is about the President of the United States asserting privileges that are time-honored privileges that have been asserted many, many times by executives of both parties, probably none more often than Bill Clinton. Executive privilege, deliberative privilege, privileges that exist so that presidents can receive information and advice without people having to worry that it's going to be repeated, because sometimes good decision making begins with bad ideas. And if you're afraid to express the bad ideas, sometimes the good ideas never emerge. So the law, in its wisdom, has created an area of privilege for our chief executive so that his aides can speak to him freely. This is not an unimportant privilege. The less discussion, the more constraints on discussion, the worse the decision making. So asserting executive privilege is not a game. It's been done probably by every single president. And what that means is the president told his aides that he's asserting executive privilege and they're not to comply with the subpoena. Also, in my particular case and several others, we assert attorney-client privilege. That's part of our Constitution. They're saying that this is a obstruction of Congress. If I were to turn over to the Congress what they are asking of me, or some of it, I would violate my oath of office as an attorney, and I could be subject to disbarment. For me to do that, for me to turn something over, I have to get a ruling of a court that tells me that it isn't privileged, or my client has to waive it. Well, neither is the case. And this whole use of these draconian techniques, even threatening to arrest lawyers for asserting the attorney-client privilege, is so beyond what we usually tolerate that it really does make the case that we're living in an age of a double standard, that we are living in an age not unlike the age of McCarthy, when people were just accused, they had no rights, can't have counsel, lawyers were attacked for representing bad people. The lawyers who represent Donald Trump are under constant attack. I am, all the time, for doing my job, for representing the President of the United States. Lawyers who represent terrorists, lawyers who represent murderers, lawyers who represent very unpopular causes are considered heroes because our profession says everyone's entitled to a defense except to the opponents of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is really not entitled to a defense. I really would ask everyone, because history is so important, to look back a bit at history and see that something similar to this happened to us in the late 1940s and the 1950s. And this book that's recently been written by David A. Nicholas, Ike and McCarthy, gives you a good, very readable description of a man named Joseph R. McCarthy, who was the Adam Schiff of his day. We could have, after you read it, an interesting debate. Who was worse, McCarthy or Schiff? It's not easy to decide who. Schiff conducted secret proceedings. Schiff demonstrably lied in ways that obstructed the investigation. Schiff gave contrary answers to his involvement with this whistleblower, who he insists remain anonymous, making very serious charges. We don't have to go into all of the different things that Schiff did, because a lot of the others of them, Pelosi and Nadler, have equally been abusive. But the point is that in that period when that happened, we were together enough as a country so that, notice the title, Ike and McCarthy. McCarthy was a Republican senator from the state of Wisconsin. Eisenhower was a Republican president who won the state of Wisconsin with McCarthy's support. McCarthy, unlike Schiff, was a popular political figure with an over 50% approval rating. But the head of his party had the courage to discipline him because he was violating the rights of the people. Because to Dwight David Eisenhower, American rights, protection of the American people is much more important than political party. Things have gone so far here that hatred of Donald Trump has completely obscured love of country, which is why we end up with a charge like obstruction of Congress. Doesn't exist. There is no charge. Congress has no power to impeach. I give, just to conclude this part of it, a silly example. Suppose Donald Trump was impeached by a majority Democrat vote of the House of Representatives for being late for 4 press conferences in a row. You say, well, that's silly. Well, it's not silly if Congress can make up what it impeaches for and is not constrained by, once again, treason, bribery, high crimes, misdemeanors. Being late for press conferences is none of those 4 things, nor is obstruction of Congress, nor is abuse of power. So what should be done? Well, there are 2 avenues, and I've written on this. One avenue is to go before the court and argue that the president's constitutional rights are being violated. The court would say, initially, this is a political question. We should stay out of it. We are not given that power. But the court wasn't given the power to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. In Marbury against Madison, our great Chief Justice Marshall created judicial review as an obvious, necessary conclusion from the Constitution, because there had to be some arbiter when there were 2 conflicting interpretations of the Constitution that the 2 different branches of government, the executive and the legislature, stood firmly behind, and there couldn't be agreement. Or the government did, the federal government did, and the states disagreed. Justice Marshall reasoned that by being the chief law agency of the United States, that the high court had that power. Well, here we have the same thing. We have a diametrically opposed executive and a partisan Congress ruled by just Democrats expressing just their will. And we have a constitutional crisis. And the court, of course, is created for that purpose. But that would take a long time. The outcome is debatable because it is a case of what we call first impression. And there's another remedy. And that remedy comes from the rules of criminal procedure. The Constitution says that the Chief Justice presides. It says nothing else. It doesn't say how he presides. But you have to assume in presiding that he would set down a set of rules so that it isn't a circus like the Schiff thing was. And the rules that normally are used are the federal rules of criminal procedure. So let's assume that this was an indictment, which is what the Chief Justice would be familiar with and what the federal rules of criminal procedure are all about. If an indictment is brought, before the trial begins, the defense must challenge the indictment for failing to state a crime. If the defense neglects to do it, it loses that argument forever. It's a mandatory motion that must be made. What it says is, yes, the government went about the work of getting an indictment and getting a grand jury to vote for it, but when you look at the final indictment and you read it, it does not charge a crime. It fails to list the necessary elements of fraud or bribery or drug dealing. And what happens is a motion under, don't want to get too technical, under Rule 12 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure is made, and the judge decides at that point, if that is the case, to dismiss it. He can dismiss it with or without prejudice. With prejudice means you can't bring it again. Without prejudice means you can fix it. Well, what should happen in the Senate is after the Democrats get a chance to present their entirely partisan picture of what they did, of their articles of impeachment that charge no impeachable offense, and the Republicans respond in their opening statement as to why this didn't happen and why this is totally unjustified. There should be a vote. A motion should be made to dismiss the articles of impeachment for failure to state an impeachable offense, similar to dismiss an indictment for failure to state a crime. I believe that that is the correct outcome. And it's the correct outcome because many arguments could be made for why it would be good for one side or the other to have a big, long trial. I could see, as a lawyer for the president and as a supporter of the president, how that would reveal facts that you don't know about the vast corruption of not just Joe Biden, but of the Democrat Party in Ukraine. It was like their breeding ground for corruption, and for some time. Despite the fact that there's some appeal to that, I stand back from it and I think of history. And what I think about is we've got to close the book on this way of doing things. In other words, we've got to go back to, you can only impeach for the reasons why the Constitution allows you to impeach. We have got to go back to what Hamilton wanted, that impeachment is rare, very rare, because it is so jarring, because it negates what our country's all about, election by the people, not by the political potentates. And if that power, this interpretation is allowed, where they can impeach for a reason they make up, we just changed the structure of our government dramatically. And we've given the House of Representatives much more power than any other branch of government, much more power than the Constitution ever envisioned. And the minute you readjust that balance of power, it's like a very, very finely tuned machine. It's going to destroy the whole machine. Congress is then going to be able to use that as threats for more money, for unworthy projects, for not investigating corrupt congressmen, of which, unfortunately, we've had some. And I've had to prosecute some of them successfully. So we need an outcome here that vindicates the law, not an outcome that appeals to our emotions. You know, those of us on the president's side, our emotion is, let's get out just how corrupt Schiff was, just how corrupt Pelosi was, what a big crook Biden and his son were, and let's see all the other Democrats that were crooks in Ukraine. You're going to see millions and millions of dollars flowing into their hands, and you're going to see a pattern with Biden that goes beyond Ukraine. When you see the words "point man Biden," then put next to it, how much money, how many millions did the family get when he got the point man job? It was a good day in the Biden family when he became point man. When he became point man in Iraq, lots of money came to his brother. When he became point man in Ukraine, lots of money came to the son and the brother. And when he became point man in China, well, you'll find out what happened. But that isn't what an impeachment's about. Impeachment should be done by strict rules. Democrats have alleged, they've alleged things that are not impeachable offenses. The Senate should make that clear, and hopefully it will act as a deterrent so another president doesn't have to go through this, and this does not become a new part of the political leverage that we have. Well, this, of course, is an unfolding story. We will follow it in more detail. I particularly look forward to bringing to you many of the facts that I have discovered that no one knows yet, that are quite dramatic, and that clearly support every single thing that we've talked about. I found those facts in my role as counsel for President Trump in order to defend him, and I can think of no more appropriate thing to do than to share them with you. They're somewhat startling, so don't get ready for it. But we will do it in a careful way, and we'll do it as we do everything else. We'll do it by applying our powers of reasoning, applying common sense. So I hope to see you very shortly, and God bless America. So let's begin. This episode and some of the ones that follow, many of them, will be about presenting to you evidence that's been kept from you deliberately about a very dangerous and corrupt group of schemes that went on in Ukraine in 2016. Much of it motivated by the desire to defeat Donald Trump and to elect Hillary Clinton. It involves corruption of all kinds, and it is complicated. But the fact is that there's been a deliberate effort to keep this information from you and to lie about it. These witnesses that I am going to discuss and present to you as if it were a trial have all wanted to come to the United States and were blocked by the American Embassy, by the State Department, by the FBI to some extent, and even when they hired a lawyer to present it to the Justice Department, and even though the lawyer made it clear that this involved proven intrusions in the 2016 election, that it involved activity by then Vice President Biden that was involved in the collusion as well as corruption. Even though these things were mentioned, the Justice Department did nothing to follow up on it. It seemed that all they were interested in were the false allegations of collusion by Russians. And so you've been deprived of this evidence, and I've been attacked, as you know, seems like monumentally for being the messenger, for having had the, I think, good fortune to develop this information, because something has to be done about it. So let me tell you how it began, and then let me get to the opening statement. This all began in November of 2018. I was brought the information. The idea that I went looking for dirt on Joe Biden or that President Trump wanted me to look for dirt on Joe Biden is totally false. And a part of the conspiracy to cover up the rather vast crimes of Democrats in the Ukraine. This information was brought to me. If you want to call it dirt, the dirt was handed to me. And it wasn't dirt. It was probable cause that crime was committed. It was given to me by reliable sources. All that I'm going to explain to you came from that. And I began investigating it in November of 2018 as a defense lawyer for the President of the United States, who was also a close personal friend and someone that I felt was being, and I know was being framed for a crime that he didn't commit because of the perversity of his opponents and their hatred, which seems has no limiting factor. So let me begin as if this were a trial. I did many as a prosecutor, having the great honor to stand up in court, get in front of a podium. I wish actually I had a podium now, and say to people, my name is Rudy Giuliani. It's my honor to represent the United States of America. I think I always got goosebumps when I did that. So this will be modified. It won't be quite like the opening statement of a trial, but we'll get as close to it as possible. So I make this understandable to you. The purpose of an opening statement is to give you a roadmap so that over the next couple of weeks, as we present the testimony of these witnesses, much of it on videotape, you'll be able to understand it and have it kind of link together, because that's how you prove complex and serious crimes. How would you start this? You would say that the charges here are the charges are simple, the fact pattern somewhat complicated, but easy once you unravel it. We have, at a minimum, 2 bribes. I know you're a little surprised because you all know about the one bribe, which is the one where Joe Biden tells Poroshenko that he must fire the prosecutor or he won't get his $1 billion loan guarantee. But you don't know about the other bribe, and that's going to come out both a bit in the opening statement and then with some pretty shocking testimony that we're going to present to you. So this involves two bribes involving then Vice President Joe Biden, and it involves collusion on the part of the White House, on the part of some officials of the Democratic National Committee and the embassy in Kiev in digging up dirt. Wonder where they got that expression, digging up dirt, on Donald Trump Jr., the Trump campaign. Paul Manafort explained to one of the witnesses by a member of the DNC right in the middle of the election, you'll hear his testimony, as we're going to destroy the Trump campaign. We're going to get him off the ballot by September of 2016. Now, remember the position I was in at the time that I heard that. I was his defense lawyer defending him against Mueller's false claims of Russian collusion. And we were 5 to 6 months before Joe Biden announced for president of the United States. So I had no thought of him as a presidential candidate. I don't want to be demeaning, but he didn't look to me like he was physically capable of running for the office of president of the United States. He did, but by the time he did, I already gathered all this evidence for the purpose of defending my client. And I am outraged at the attacks on me, not on a personal basis. I'm a pretty tough guy, and I've been threatened with death by people a lot more dangerous than these idiots. But the reality is, I'm outraged that the vast majority of the media doesn't realize, seems to ignore the fact that the reason this is being done is to intimidate me in my role as a lawyer. That's what they're doing. They're trying to kill the messenger because they can't deal with the message of this extensive Democratic corruption. With the shoe on the other foot, and I was talking about Republican corruption, they'd probably make me man of the year. And that's a double standard we have to deal with. But ladies and gentlemen, people of America, here's the evidence that was kept from you. It's easy. I mean, it begins with a confession, an admission, a confession, however you want to describe it. Many of you have probably seen it. Some of you haven't. Let me first give you the definition of the crime of bribery. Corruptly offering something of value in exchange for official action. That's the definition under the United States Code. That's pretty much a universal definition, including in the country of Ukraine. So now, listen to the tape, and I will tell you the words to particularly focus on, because it's in that one sentence, just one little sentence, that the crime of bribery is committed. This is a statement by Joe Biden. The date is January 23rd, 2018. And I'm just going to read you one sentence by Joe Biden. If the prosecutor is not fired, you're not getting the money. If the prosecutor is not fired, is the official action. You're not getting the money, is the something of value that's put at stake. That's the crime of bribery. All you need to add now is corruptly, and I'll show you very simply how we do that. But now you make sure that I'm right. You listen to that portion of the video.
They were walking out to the press conference. I said, "No," I said, "I'm not going to. We're not going to give you the $1 billion." They said, "You have no authority. You're not the president." The president said. I said, "Call him." I said, "I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion." I said, "You're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here." And I think it was 6 hours. I looked. I said, "I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money." Well, son of a bitch, got fired, and they put in place someone who was solid.
Well, as you see, I quoted it correctly, and it's a lot more complete than that. This is not just a bribe. This could also be considered an extortion, because this was done by threat. This wasn't like a business deal. I'm going to leave here I think it was about 6 hours. I looked at them and said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, he got fired, and they put in place someone who was solid at the time. He sure was solid, because ultimately the case on his son, the case on his son's crooked boss who stole $5 billion. I said $5 billion. And his son's corrupt company, Burisma, just went away. And he was able to come back to the Ukraine with his $5 billion intact, with his business intact, even though he was one of the better-known organized criminals in the Yanukovych government, leading a really good life thanks to Joe Biden's bribery of President Poroshenko. You really just need this to convict him. He does it himself. And it's worse. It's worse because in this, he never mentions that his son was under investigation by the very prosecutor who he wanted fired. He leaves it out. It's, in a way, by omission, it's a false exculpatory statement, meaning it's evidence of his guilt. It's evidence that supplies that corruptly part of corruptly offering something of value in exchange for official action. So how do we go on beyond this now to prove it? Now, this is where it gets to, you call witnesses. So we'll call witnesses. And first witness that I'm going to call, and you'll see his testimony live all throughout the trial. We'll play it. Is the main witness, the man who was fired, Viktor Shokin. Viktor Shokin was the prosecutor general of Ukraine, which would make him equivalent to our attorney general, and really a little bit different. I mean, he clearly is the chief prosecutor. He handles all the crimes in the Ukraine. And Viktor Shokin was appointed to that job in 2015. I have here various statements from him. I interviewed him by Skype on January 23rd, 2018. I emphasize the time because that's when the Mueller investigation was still going on, and it is before Joe Biden was a candidate for president of the United States. And I never asked about Joe Biden. I was told about Joe Biden. I was shown that video clip that you saw, and I was shocked. I didn't believe it at first. Then I listened to it again, and I was with, other people, and I said, this is about a clearer case of bribery as I've ever seen. And I can't believe he got away with saying this. And then I said, it's going to be really tough. They're going to do everything to protect this guy. He's one of the, anointed in the annals of the swamp media. So Viktor Shokin was appointed in 2015. The case against Burisma was already going on. What Viktor Shokin can describe and his other prosecutors is that Mykola Zlochevsky, these are, I know, difficult names, but Mykola Zlochevsky owned a company called Burisma that was incorporated in Cyprus. And he owned it at the same time that he was the minister of the ecology and other positions under the president Yanukovych, who is the one that was very, very favorable to Russia. We're going to take a short break, and we're going to come right back, and we're going to go right to the testimony of Shokin, or at least a brief description of it. So we left off with Viktor Shokin and what he will contribute to the trial. Viktor Shokin will testify that he was investigating Burisma, attempting to get the money back that had been stolen by Mykola Zlochevsky, because when Zlochevsky was the minister of the ecology, he had granted mineral rights and oil rights to his own company, Burisma. He made a huge amount of money while he was the minister, and he kept it all outside the country. He laundered it, a lot of it through Bank Privat. So we don't know exactly how much he stole, but people think it's as much as $5 billion. All of a sudden, there was the revolution. And, Yanukovych was thrown out and his entire mafia went with him. That's what they'll call Yanukovych's mafia. And Mykola Zlochevsky was one of the more prominent members of it. They all ran away. They all had been laundering money out of the country, getting ready for this day for quite some time. So they were in good shape financially. Yanukovych went to Russia and Zlochevsky, Switzerland, I believe, or a couple of other places, but with his $5 billion. But he was very afraid that the new government, which was going to be supposedly a reform government, was going to take his business away from him. And they already began actions against him in the UK to take his money away from him. And he needed protection. He needed someone that could deal with Poroshenko, have more power than Poroshenko, and be able to, if necessary, push Poroshenko into dropping the case, of course, for a sizable bribe. He wasn't going to ask Poroshenko to do it for nothing. He hired Biden for protection of his company. If the day would come that the Ukrainian government tried to take his company away and his money away, it was going to be Biden's job to protect him. That's the second bribe. That's a bribe to the vice president of the United States. Biden agreed, and his son went to work for the company for ridiculous amounts of money. Remember, his son had no experience in oil and gas. His son had a very spotty, if not unsuccessful, record in business. His son had been involved in several questionable other attempts to sell Joe Biden's office when he was senator. The whole situation with the bank that he worked for was a scandal never investigated. He also had a company that virtually went bankrupt, and he suffers from drug addiction seriously. Many situations of in and out of rehab, one very prominent one when he failed his drug test and was thrown out of the United States Navy, just a short while before he was put on the board of this crooked company. So a very unlikely choice. There'd be no reason to hire Hunter Biden other than to buy Joe Biden. No reason. And there are witnesses who can testify to that. So you will hear that during our trial. 2 bribes. First one is Zlochevsky buys Joe Biden's protection in case Poroshenko wants to take his business away, in case the Ukrainian government wants to take his business away. And he pays him off in part by paying somewhere between $5 and $8 million to his son's company, which had no business purpose of any kind other than as a bribe to Joe Biden. There also is indications of other money going to Biden. There's a $900,000 wire transfer. A coincidence that he got fired in February, March of 2016, because on the second day of February 2016, he arrested the Burisma company. Remember all these Biden hacks say that the case was dormant? Well, right on the record, there's an arrest of Burisma on February 2nd of 2016. Hardly a dormant case. I got the files here. These are the files. They're lying. They're lying, and the press is just accepting it. It's really, really a very serious matter, the way our press is so corrupt. So, there is clear proof that Burisma was under investigation. I believe it's February 2nd, February 3rd. The prosecutor's office, really under the direction of Konstantin Kulyuk, who was Viktor Shokin's subordinate, basically raid Burisma, closed the business down. The day has now come for Joe Biden to do his part, because now the government is coming after the company. Combine that with another fact that happens in the middle of February, and that is that the prosecutor, Shokin and Kulyuk, receive a notice from Latvia. And I'm just going to read it to you because this pretty much definitively puts the lie to these Democrats who say there was no investigation. This is a document from the Prosecutor's Office of the Republic of Latvia. And it is dated the 18th of February, 2016. And it says, according to publicly available information, Burisma Holding Limited and its director, Hunter Biden, are involved in corruption affair. The following transactions made to Burisma Holding Limited account in AS Privat Bank are known to the Latvian FIU, their Financial Investigation Unit. And what they describe is a transfer of $14.7 million from Ukraine, WireLogic Technology, as a payment for loans. It then goes to another company, Digitech Organization, LLP, and eventually it goes from Ukraine to Latvia, Latvia to Cyprus, and there it's dispersed to people like Alan Apter, Alexander Kwasniewski, members of the board of Burisma, and two other people, Hunter Biden and his partner, Devin Archer. The only difference is the amounts of money that are sent to Alan Apter and Alexander Kwasniewski are listed. The amount sent to Archer and Biden is not. From the records of their company, however, you find that they received $3 million. This is an out-and-out money laundering case. So in addition to bribery, this is what you would call a smoking gun for a prosecutor. Right on paper, in more detail than I just described it. I mean, here's, if you'd like to take a look, this is the document in English, just so you know it's an authentic document. This is the document or part of it in Ukrainian, in which the money laundering is demonstrated about 4 or 5 different ways. There's the chart of the money laundering. This is all from the files of the prosecutor's office, the prosecutor that wasn't investigating Burisma and Hunter Biden, except right in the file on February 16th of 2016, they were investigating Hunter Biden. Liars. They're liars. They're really, really serial liars. Just at that time, coincidentally, just at that time, and Shokin was in the middle of this, there are 3 telephone calls between the Vice President of the United States and the President of Ukraine, Poroshenko, like February 5th, February 8th, February 16th. We'll get the exact dates for you. It doesn't appear to be any other month where there are 3 phone calls between them, and it's right in the middle of Burisma being raided and Hunter Biden's name coming up as one of the principals in the money laundering scheme. So it doesn't take a lot to figure out what those conversations were about. Would be nice if somebody had investigated this and gotten those conversations, wouldn't it? Like the FBI or the Justice Department. Since we have a prima facie case of bribery and got a prima facie case of money laundering, but I guess if you're a Democrat, they don't do things like that. But there are 3 telephone conversations, and Shokin says that during that period of time, the president of Ukraine was coming to him, Shokin will testify, and telling him he better go easy on the company. And he better go easy on Hunter Biden because Joe Biden has given him a lot of pressure. Telephone calls kind of corroborate that, 3 of them, within a week and a half. And then on Shokin's end of it, we find out the other side of what Joe Biden admitted on tape, demanding that Shokin be fired. And if not, you're not getting your loan guarantee. Poroshenko comes to him and says, I've got to ask you to resign because if you don't, we're going to lose our loan guarantee and we're pretty much on the brink of bankruptcy, basically because of all the stealing of the prior administration. And we will later find out all of the stealing Poroshenko was doing himself. So Shokin has to leave. there's no doubt that he's telling the truth. The idea that he's corrupt or whatever else he is, all he does is corroborate what Biden says on tape. He can be corrupt as heck. I mean, a lot of corrupt people make very powerful witnesses. I mean, most of the really bad criminals I convicted, there was usually a corrupt person who turned or, testified against him. However, this idea that he was so corrupt is also created. We have documents here showing his entire record. If he was corrupt, he really hid it. He never was arrested, never was charged with corruption. Never, in all of his years of law practice, had a complaint against him. If he was corrupt, he sure wasn't good at it because I've met him. He's not a rich man. Some of these people really have incredible wealth, billions from their stealing. It's not Shokin. But in any event, he's a corroborating witness to Joe Biden's confession. He says, yeah, Biden was telling the truth. He got Poroshenko to fire me. And he got Poroshenko to fire me because I was investigating his son, I was investigating his patron, Zlochevsky, and I was investigating the Burisma company. And I had finally kind of hit pay dirt with the money laundering that I showed you. This testimony is then backed up by documents that I have here. I also have here something of great concern, and that is in September of this year, Mr. Shokin, after his affidavit was revealed publicly, in which he lays all of this out under oath, not like this whistleblower, not wanting to come forward. This guy is under oath, ready to testify. After that happened, all of a sudden, one night, he got very sick. He went to the hospital. According to the medical report, he almost died twice. He was taken from Ukraine because of fear that this was a poisoning. And he went to the same hospital that has saved other people that were subjected to Ukrainian and Russian poisoning. And the doctor is world famous. It's Dr. I believe his name is Korpan. And I remember this from a prior incident in Ukraine because the name of the clinic is the Rudolph Clinic. So you kind of remember Rudolph is not that common a name. But we will present to you in the course of the trial, and when we get to his testimony, we'll present to you all the medical records from Austria, not Ukraine. And I'd like you to look at this. It's just very simple, and we'll go into detail on it. But primary diagnosis, I think that says mercury poisoning. That's a translation from the German. I translated it myself using a iPhone app. It says mercury poisoning. It then goes on to describe how much mercury was in his system. It's about 5 times more than you can possibly tolerate. They used denominations like 2 is the top, and he was at 9. Dr. Korpan says there's no other way this could have happened but by a poisoning. You couldn't do this accidentally. So there was an attempt to kill Shokin, which gives you an idea of how serious what we're dealing with is. This is a very, very serious matter. There are other witnesses that we will discuss in our next episode. Then we'll go through the testimony of Andrei Teleshenko, who has a great deal to say because he was both a prosecutor and then later he was the number 3 or 4 person in the Ukrainian embassy in Washington during the election. And he will testify at great length as to how the Ukrainian embassy, the Ukrainian officials conspired with the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's campaign. And he was directly asked to dig up all the dirt that he could on Donald Trump Jr. He was asked to see if he could find evidence of a connection of Donald Trump to Russian organized crime, Ukrainian organized crime. And he was told very intimately about a false piece of evidence that was created. That's established by his testimony, and it's established by this text from a woman working for the DNC named Shalupa to Luis Miranda, another smoking gun that corroborates the fact that she was feeding information from Ukrainians to a reporter, an American reporter named Michael Isikoff, Isn't this exactly what they were investigating Trump for? Using foreign information in an American campaign? She brags about how successful she is. And then she says, another big thing is coming up that I've got to talk to you about. That's going to be the phony Black Ledger. We're going to prove that it's phony and that it was created not so much to prosecute Manafort, but in the words of Chalupa and in the words of another character here, Lashenko, who actually did the deed of leaking it. It was intended to destroy the Trump campaign with a plan to execute it in August and September. A plan that Chalupa claims was discussed with an American member of Congress, who we will name as we move along. And then we'll have several other witnesses that will show the length and the breadth of the corruption. We will produce a legal opinion because there's doubt as to whether these constituted violations of Ukrainian law. Mr. Lutsenko had changed his testimony on that, actually 3 times. But one reason might be because Lutsenko is not a lawyer. It's kind of unusual that Joe Biden would recommend a non-lawyer to be prosecutor general of Ukraine. The other reason might be that he was protecting his patron, Poroshenko, because what you're going to find out is there's testimony that Poroshenko may have received. That's the president of the Ukraine, Biden's pal. That's the guy that Biden intimidated. But Poroshenko wasn't going to let Zlochevsky come back to Ukraine, keeping his $5 billion and getting his company without, as they say in The Godfather, wetting his beak. It is well known that Poroshenko took something out of almost every transaction in Ukraine. Here, there's a dispute about exactly how much. It could range up as high as $100 million. It sounds strange to you and me, but that's what was happening in the Yanukovych administration. And according to witnesses that we'll call, things were much worse under Poroshenko. And the corruption in Ukraine became much worse during the Obama administration because Americans started to participate in the corruption at a much higher level. And one last thing that I find very, very disturbing, and I think my client would find this very disturbing. This is an accounting chamber decision. This is an independent accounting group in Ukraine. It's dated December 19, 2017, kind of toward the end of the Obama administration. And it finds that there is 440 projects of international technical assistance given by other countries to Ukraine, with a total cost of over $5.2 billion, in which there doesn't appear to be either documentation, any evidence of work done, any support to justify the money. The vast majority of this money came from the United States. And the police in Ukraine began an investigation really to kind of answer what they thought was going to be the Obama administration coming down really hard on them for wasting so much money. Instead, you will hear testimony that representatives of our embassy working for Ambassador, first I think it's Pyatt, and then Yovanovitch, they told them not to go forward with the investigation. That we're friends and this doesn't really matter. And 5.2 billion, maybe 3.54 billion being our own money. It doesn't matter if they were wasting it. Well, you know why? The witnesses will tell you the reason is that the basic problem here for at least 3 billion of that 5.2 is that when America was giving aid to Ukraine, it was doing it through what are called non-government organizations, not directly to Ukraine. A lot of that money never showed up in the Department of Ecology or the Prosecutor General's office. A lot of it kind of stuck with the NGO. There's a common theme in all of these NGOs, by the way, as they will testify. They call them children of Soros. One of the main ones is Antac, which had its own investigation that was corruptly, dismissed by Yovanovitch. But all of them are extremely left-wing. There'll be testimony to that effect and documentary proof. And this still has never been explained. We're talking about billions of dollars in American aid that's unaccounted for, that went to Soros's NGOs like Soros's, extremely left-wing, some of them not even in Ukraine. There's one here that involved Italy getting $4 million to straighten out corruption. It was intended for the Prosecutor General's office, and it was given to a NGO in Italy. And then you wonder why, when they fire Shokin, they can get people from Italy and England and Germany and to all say that he's corrupt. They're all people from the NGOs that were being paid off. This is a vast crime. This is probably, obviously, going to be the biggest scandal so far of this century. Let's hope there's none greater. It makes Teapot Dome look cheap when we get finished with the amounts of money. And there's a lot more to it. And in the next episode, we'll finish the outline. You've got most of it. And then we'll get right to the testimony. And you'll get to see some of these witnesses on camera for yourself to see that we have something called proof, which Democrats do not have against the president and never had. And we have something else on our side that makes it easy to accept all the attacks on me, my reputation, my family, and the threats. You know what we have on our side? Truth. Spent a lot of my career fighting corruption. I've done many, many difficult corruption cases. And some of them I've done when nobody thought the case could be proved or it could ever be done, like the Commission of the Mafia, Wall Street, using the racketeering laws in ways that had never been used before, sending two Nazis back to what they deserved, with one case being terribly controversial. People ask me, how can you take it, all the criticism and all the... Because when I go to bed at night, I know that I'm doing what I wanted to do from the day I became a lawyer. I'm serving justice. I know it sounds corny, but this is corruption. This is corruption at a very, very high level. It doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or a Republican. It was an American vice president that sold out his office, and he sold out the integrity of the United States of America. We are a joke in Ukraine. We go there and we say, you should stop the corruption. And every time Joe Biden went there, they laughed at him. You're telling us to stop the corruption? And you're pulling millions out of here? We have got to fix this. It's a matter of national security. It's a matter of having a solid relationship and creating a solid situation in a country that's enormously important to us. But if we're going to send them $100 million in aid, and only 20 million is going to get to where it's supposed to go, maybe you can see why the president was concerned. And because the Democrats are the major beneficiaries of this corruption, maybe you can see why they're doing this phony impeachment. Because, boy, this is phony as you know what, based on hearsay and nonsense. This is based on evidence. And you're going to hear it all over the next couple of weeks. Thank you very much.
Please subscribe to our backup channels, Net4Truth USA 2 Patriot channel, BitChute.com/net4Truth USA, and drop.space /@Net4Truth USA. We fly so close to the target, we are on our 5th fighter jet. We will be relentless and persistent until the enemies of freedom are defeated. You can support this channel by using the links in the description, but for a $100 donation, I will personally send you a autographed hardcover special edition copy of Land of Childhood's Fears. Also, visit my bookstore at lulu.com/Net4Truth USA. If you are viewing this video on BitChute, You can use the links in the description to support us, or simply click the green $ dot on our video to support this channel. Thank you. Links are in the description section.